are ready to hear from Jess Gill from BC, British Columbia. Jess is also very experienced with teaching internationally, teacher training, and as well as consultant at ETS. And although she didn't teach in the program when the people went there, so you probably haven't taken courses from her, but I'm sure her experience with teacher training and teaching in other countries will give us lots of great ideas today. So let's welcome Jess for her presentation.
Can you hear me without the mic, or should I use the mic? Use the mic? Yeah. I thought I have a very loud voice. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here to all of you. It's my first visit to Taiwan, so I'm quite excited about being here. Can you turn it off? No, it's not on right now. All right.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay.
This is my first visit to Taiwan, and I'm very happy to be here and to be able to join this conference. So far it's been wonderful. I'm really impressed with all the sessions I've heard this morning, and to see what you're all doing in your classes. So my talk today is really looking at what we do in the classroom. I'm going to give a little bit of background and set a framework, and then really look at some practical classroom ideas. I have the opportunity to observe and visit a lot of classes. Some of my visits are very informal, where I can drop into a classroom and maybe take a visitor to a class. And others are more formal. They're observations of new teachers or observations of people who we've hired and looking at hiring teachers long term. And I've talked to a lot of teachers about lessons. We reflect a lot about what we've seen in the classroom. And every lesson is, of course, quite unique, and I think that will always be the case. But some lessons are much more effective than others, and I think we all know that, and that's due to a lot of factors. And over the years, I've sort of realized that there's three main things that we look at when we're planning and observing or looking at teachers in the classroom. And I find that there are three things that contributed to the success of a lesson. Clear outcomes, sound delivery, and materials and tasks that are engaging for students. I think those are the three kind of broad areas that we can look at when we look at what is a successful lesson. On the other side of working with teachers, I also have to deal with a lot of students, and I work with young adults and who are often quite vocal about their view of their classes, and so I often listen to student concerns about problems that they may have or concerns that they have about their classes. And it's interesting, but maybe not surprising, it's the same three things that students often will have concerns about. If there's a problem in the class, usually it's to do with they're not sure what the outcomes are of a lesson, or the delivery might not match the student's style of learning, or it could be the tasks, the materials, just not keeping the students' interest and maximizing their chances for learning. So we're going to look a little bit at those three topics. So again, I think this is all stuff that you've probably all learned in your teacher training, but I think every lesson starts with very clear linguistic outcomes or objectives. I think if we add in really a sound delivery and then followed by engaging materials, engaging tasks, and I think we have the formula for an effective lesson, a pedagogically effective lesson. And as I said, I think we can look at this formula for all levels of teaching language classes as well as any other classroom. I think that we would identify that these are the key things that we look at in our practice. I think also when we're in the classroom, after the class, there are a lot of key questions that teachers will ask themselves, or observers will ask a teacher when reflecting on the lesson. And for me, these are the questions I always ask if I've observed the class and we're in a follow-up session. Were was the objectives clear, and were they met? Also, unfortunately, I've sometimes been in classrooms where there could be a lot of activity, students seem busy, and there's lots going on, but sometimes I leave the class and I'm not really sure what the objective was. And I think that happens sometimes when we get busy in the classroom, we do all sorts of activities, but sometimes I think we can have a lesson where the objectives are not that clear. Did the delivery maximize learning? And I think that this is the key that we're always looking for, is we want to maximize every opportunity we have in the classroom so that there's a benefit to students, as much as possible. Did the materials tasks, did they support the objectives? That's a question I think that's important. And did they optimize student learning? And of course, the question I always like to ask is, were the students engaged? And were they engaged for the entire time? Part of the class, how much of the class were they on task and engaged? And I think we can get input when we reflect on our classes, of course, your own reflection, but also from peers, inviting other teachers into the classroom to give us feedback on these areas. And also through professional development opportunities. I think these are the kinds of questions we should be asking. And unfortunately, I know as teachers we're very busy. We prepare lessons, we have so much marking to do. Some people teach a lot of hours, we have large classes. There's not always time to reflect on what we do. But I think it's really important to figure out how we can reflect on our lessons so that we can, make improvements as we go along. And the other thing that I know I've done, and there were a few teachers that I work with who I've always thought, I really would love to be in their class and to see what they do. I know they're just fantastic teachers, and so for a couple of them, I asked if I could observe their class and just see what they do. So I set up an exchange with one of our instructors, and we did a bit of a peer mentoring session where I went to her class, she came to my class, and we shared a lot of ideas about, and I learned a tremendous amount of what she does in her classroom, and I also realized why she's such a fantastic teacher. And I think if we can get opportunities like that, that also will inform our practice, and it's simple enough to organize, but it just takes time. And it's like everything, it's difficult to do that in our jobs. I think if there's a mismatch between, if some of these questions if we can't answer them in the positive, I think sometimes we get this type of classroom situation. Has that ever happened to you? Sometimes I've observed a teacher, and we have a debrief after the lesson, and the teacher will say to me, oh, it was a fantastic lesson. And then sometimes I'm not sure if the teacher's interpretation is always the same as the student's interpretation. And so I quite like this little strip because I think that does happen sometimes. And I think where the problems lie here is often in setting objectives. I think if the starting point of our lesson is not a clear set of objectives, I think it can be confusing to students as to what are we trying to learn here? What is the purpose of this lesson? Sometimes I've watched classes where it seems that the materials or the tasks drive the lesson. So rather than objectives. And I've seen a series of activities, but it's not always, but the starting point should be the objectives. And I think that's sometimes where you can get confusion, is we're doing all these activities, but I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be learning here. There's lots of questions around objectives, and I think in your programs, the objectives are quite clear in terms of where they fit in your curriculum. Other questions we have to ask are they measurable? Can we measure what we're trying to teach here? How do we measure objectives, and how do we assess whether the students have mastered them? These are lots of things that we're doing in the classroom where we're setting objectives, we're looking at how do we measure them, how do we assess them. And so there's lots of questions around objectives. level that I work with young, maybe at the senior high school level or with young adults, I think it's important for students to be aware of what the outcomes are of a class. One of the things I think I learned, well, probably one of the most important things I learned in my teacher training many, many years ago, was one of my professors told me, when students leave your class every day, they should be able to say, I learned this today. When I came in, I didn't know this, but now I know this. And I always ask that question to teachers when I'm observing classes. Can the students identify what is it that they learned in this class today that they didn't know? And I thought that it's always a good way of looking at or evaluating a lesson. Okay, what exactly did the students walk away with that they didn't have? We looked at the confused students. I think also, if the goals are clear, I think students will be motivated. And that's where I find sometimes there's a lack of motivation, or if students aren't clear about what it is that they're supposed to be doing, I think we can get unmotivated learners sometimes. And I like this cartoon. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it back there. It's a good Canadian cartoon. Can you read it from the back? Is it? All right, is everybody okay? So clearly, these two young fellows were not very motivated to clear the snow away. But once they realized that there's a reason to do it, and a good reason, they're quite happy and quite motivated to clear off the snow in the driveway, because it's something that's going to affect them, something that will affect their lives and make their, in this case, allow their parents to drive them around the city. And without doing that, of course, they're not going anywhere. So I thought that kind of reminded me a little bit of, of making sure our learners do know why they are doing something. And I find that if they do know, there is this more motivation to work with the teacher in the activity. The other area I mentioned earlier, sound delivery. Now this is difficult because there's so many things for us to consider when we're delivering a lesson. And it's a really complex process, not easy. And I think teachers are amazing that we do this every day in every lesson, multiple times a day. There's so many things that we have to think about. We have to think about what are our students' needs? What are their levels? How do we motivate them? How do we keep them engaged? What techniques will I use? What shall I use? Shall I use a lecture style? Am I going to use small groups? Am I going to? So every time we're teaching, there's so many questions that we're answering. How does a lesson progress? What do I do first? What am I going to do second? Lots of decisions are involved in everything we do. Pacing, timing, these are really important things in teaching. If it's too fast, if it's too slow, we have a problem. Groupings. It was interesting, we were talking a little bit about that this morning. How do we group our students? By level, by interest. There's lots of decisions that go into groupings. How do we measure comprehension? Are the students understanding at each point of the lesson? Do they understand what we're doing? What lesson aids are we going to use? And teacher talk, that's a good one. How do we avoid teacher talk, and how do we make the lesson more student-centered? So many questions that go into every lesson that we deliver. And I think it's a hard job. It's a very difficult job that we do. And I think sometimes we have an idea and we think it's going to work, but maybe it doesn't work so well. Or one time it works and then you try it a couple of months later and it doesn't work very well. So much also depends on who's in your class. But I think if we look at the delivery makes a big difference. As you can see in the first part, the students don't seem too interested in what's happening in the classroom. But if we just flip it around a little bit, in this situation, the students are rising and they're much more involved in what they're doing. Of course, we can't always do this, but I think we have to look at options as to what is the best delivery technique that we can for that specific group that we're working with. There's lots of trial and error in our profession. It's sometimes, as I said, it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think by trying all these different things, we have a whole bag of tricks, and we choose what will work in each specific situation. And it's a tough job. And then finally, the last area, of course, that's really important is tasks, materials that we use. Lots of questions we ask when we choose materials and we look at tasks that we're going to ask for our students to do. Of course, there has to be a connection to the objectives. How available are materials? How suitable are they? Are they practical for my situation? Might work in a large class, but maybe not in a smaller class. Materials, if we're designing them ourselves, I think they have to, of course, be well designed or well chosen if we're choosing them. Teacher prep time, here's the big question. Material design takes a long time, designing materials, and how much time do we have, and how much energy can we put into designing a new set of materials every time we teach a lesson. I know it's a constant, I think we're perfectionists in a way. We use something and then we want to make it better, and we revise it and we use it again and we make it better, and huge amount of time goes into designing materials. Are our materials of high interest? Are students going to be interested in these? Do we have a variety of materials? We don't want to always use the same kind of material. How do we ensure that we have variety? Student-centeredness, talked about, are they engaging? Will students be able to, will they be involved in these materials? Will they allow for students to interact? Critical thinking, independent thinking, I think that's important. We want our students to be able to evaluate and have higher level skills. So they should be materials, we want materials that lend themselves to critical thinking. And this is an important one for me, the value of handouts. I've seen a lot of classes where people give a lot of handouts out. And sometimes I wonder about the value of some of the handouts. It seems students are busy with lots of paper, but I'm always unsure about the value of, do we need so many handouts? Now, sometimes I find students get so focused on that, on filling in handouts, and would it be better to not have a handout? Could we just use the board, or could we use something else? So I think it's an important question to ask. Do we always need, how many handouts do we need for a specific lesson? I just have one of our instructors is very insecure without her pile of handouts, and she actually has a little suitcase that she carries around, and I'm amazed at how many materials she has, and I'm just curious of how a lot of time goes into preparing those handouts and copying them, and I'm always wondering if it's necessary to really have so many materials. And of course, we want to use our resources so that we're not constantly making new things. How can we optimize what we use? And so that one handout can carry us out through the lesson, and we don't have to spend so much time making new materials. Let's optimize what we have. If it's a course book, how can we use this course book so that I don't have to bring in so many new materials to support what I do? And I think materials, it's important. I think if our materials aren't engaging, we're going to have maybe students who are not so engaged. I think in this situation, it's looking at the delivery, but maybe if the teacher was using some other kind of material, the students would not be would be paying more attention than they are here. I mean, obviously something is missing here. And I think it might be the materials, maybe it's the delivery, but there's a disconnect here between what's happening with the teacher and the students. From a student perspective, as I said, I talk to a lot of students, and often these are the kinds of things that students say to me when there's a problem with a lesson or a class. Sometimes lessons are too fast, they're too slow, the pacing. It's too easy, too difficult. I'm sure you've heard all of these things. And these are things that we have to address when we reflect on what we do. It's not active. Students I'm sitting down too long. And related to that, too much teacher talk. It's not interesting. I'm sure you've heard that before in my class. It's not relevant. I think this is maybe more for older learners, maybe young adults who will say, I need this, I don't need this. I think at the younger age, they can't quite articulate that. But older learners will tell you, or they'll tell me, this is not what I need this. And I think that often you'll get this, what we call tuned out learners. You know, they're not there, they're not paying attention, we've lost them. And these are some of the reasons why you might lose them, and I'm sure there are many others. But I found these some interesting. So I thought this was kind of relevant to the previous slide. I was looking at this American study that was done, and I was quite. This is not just language classes; this is in general, and I was kind of surprised to find out. That this idea that students are not interested, they're tuned out, they're not paying attention in class. And I thought that the reasons were quite interesting. If you look at, so about half the students in U.S. schools are not interested, they're feeling bored. But it's interesting, out of the ones who specified why, 75% felt that the materials weren't interesting. And I thought, wow, that's pretty high. That the materials have rated so high. Material wasn't relevant to me. That's also quite high. The work wasn't challenging. And that's interesting. That they're finding it too easy. And no interaction with the teacher. And I guess that's more where the teacher is delivering the lesson, but not interacting with students. Or the work was too difficult. So this kind of comments from students about challenges that they may have from their perspective. And I like this quote about what is effective instruction. I mean, how do we define what is an effective lesson? And I quite like this definition here, if you have a minute to read it. The second sentence, or the third sentence, engagement is not about being busy. Right? It's about being involved in meaningful and important challenges. Because that's sometimes I've noticed, sometimes we feel that, or I've noticed in classes that I've watched, if students are busy, then they're learning and they're active. But I don't think that's the case always. Being busy does not always mean that there's learning happening. So I think we have to look at, going back to the title of the presentation, the three key things in the classroom. And there's a connection between the objectives and the tasks and the delivery. All of these things work together. And I think if one area falls short for missing, if the objectives are not clear or if the materials don't work, I think the lesson can fall short of what the goal is. And as I said, when I've been in the observing class, this is where I find it's usually quite clear to identify where the problem might be in a class. We're just going to look at some practical ideas as how we can, address some of these three main areas. We're going to look at a couple of lessons, and I'm going to put you to work a little bit to look at how we can take a lesson that materials that we've used before, and how we can optimize them and create a more better learning environment for students. So we're going to look at how can we create a strong relationship between the three, the goals, the delivery, and the materials. How can we create more opportunities to practice and use the target language? There was times when I've been in a class, I said, oh, you should do this. Because the material is great, but we haven't maximized how to use it. There's so much more that we could have done in the class and allowed students to be more involved and practice the language more. Sometimes I think objectives can be quite narrow. You know, how can we expand the objectives so that one activity can address more than just one specific objective? And again, using materials to maximize learning. Student engagement, I've heard a lot about that this morning. It seems a lot of you have been, this is a topic that seems to be quite timely for a lot of people. How do we keep our students engaged? Because if we don't, then I think we lose them in the classroom. Student-centered classroom, and I like the last one because it's like my name. How do we jazz up our materials? You know, somebody gave me this phrase, and I thought that's a good phrase. I think in most of your situations you have course books or you have books that you have to work from. Is that the case? Yeah. Okay. Well, I think there are opportunities to work with what we have to kind of make them so that they can be more appealing to students or involve them more, where they really get into what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up a page here from a course book, but I'm going to ask you to do an exercise. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you just to, after I put this up, you're going to just work with a partner, and you'll have to write, if you've got some paper or something where you can write down a couple of things. Then I'm going to ask you to work with your partner, do a little exercise. So among somebody, you just need a pen for this and then a piece of paper. Okay, so I'm going to put up a page from a course book, probably something that looks very familiar to you. See it in the back. Okay, so I'm going to put this up and I'm going to give you 2 minutes to read the reading. And after you're finished with your partner, please write down as much as you can about the reading that you remember, okay, in sentences. All right, so here's the reading. Is that big enough? No, can I make it bigger? Yeah, it's okay. All right, so you have about 2 minutes to read this. No notes while you're reading. Okay, no notes yet. Okay. Just read it.